Hello and welcome back to Manbil. So we are on a fast trajectory towards the end of this series, and there is so far basically only two steps left, which is what I call objectivity or objectivology and ethics. And the results of these either two would be objectivity or a definition of it and presenting a moral principle. Now, since we're so close to the end now, right? I wonder if you have some kind of notion where this will lead, that you feel that all bases have been covered, at least at some meta level, which is important to understand that philosophy is not dealing with actual, for instance, cognitions. There are millions of, I don't know, let's say thousands of different cognitions, and for each cognition there are potentially thousands and millions of instances of that actual kind of cognition. You could say the animal kingdom, there are somewhere between 5 and 10 million different species, which you maybe could classify, if you want, each as a cognition. And for each species, maybe termites or ants, there are, what about stars in the universe and so on, right? You can keep going with this. So obviously you cannot work with each item, each kind of knowledge, right? If there's an elephant over there and there's an elephant over there, each of them, they are the same cognition, but they are different knowledge, right? And I hope that comes across, and that might not have been so sufficiently clear in my epistemology part. And that's why we're talking about recognition, and Johnny Isometric mentioned that in his questions, and that is actually a decently important aspect, I suppose, right? There's an elephant over there and there's an elephant over there, right? They're the same cognition, but they're different knowledge. That elephant might be the one I'm going to hunt. That elephant might be the one you're going to hunt, right? We are hunting the same cognition, but we have different instances of that cognition. Each of those are knowledge. So did you also see what I was doing here with my hands? I was pointing, right? Because it's necessary to point. And I remember years back, before I even was doing anything remotely close to what I'm going to present here, right? There was and I have tried to find it and haven't been able to find it. Maybe I haven't done enough to do it, right? And maybe it doesn't really matter. But I remember somebody discussing, I think it was within epistemology, but I'm not sure, right, what the label was. But it would probably be, or at least within some kind of communication or, description of what would be known as reality and so on, right? Pointing was one of his main cornerstones, was pointing at something. And I thought, I remember thinking, yeah, that's sort of an interesting, I never thought of that, aspect before. But when I sort of delved into my own philosophy, at some point I ended up with pointing as an integral part of this. And I kind of understood what he was probably trying to go at. I don't remember what he said. I only remember this sort of topic, the pointing aspect. What the rest of it, I don't know, right? Maybe you can help me, right? But as we go further into this will be a very important aspect to deal with. And before I do that, I have this little slide here that the underlying idea is always the core of the philosophy. It is the idea I work in accordance with, not the composition of my phenomena at the moment. Unless that is what I have to deal with in knowledge, right? So you're moving between the idea of something and a manifestation of that something. But it's the idea of dealing with it that guides how I approach that, right? So philosophy has a sort of a meta level, and it doesn't get closer, because that would be an individual having, I'm going closer, but I'm not telling you to go closer, right? So in order for me to present my philosophy, I can talk about cats and dogs only as an idea, not that I'm experiencing a cat, therefore philosophy. That would not work, right? So you have to find some underlying ideas to work from, I think, in order to make it coherent philosophy. And an example could be from scientific approach, right? The heliocentric model. There's an underlying idea between the older model was the geocentric, I think it's called, right? The Earth-centered, or that too, so far. Earth-centered and sun-centered, right? Back in the day, people thought of themselves as the center of the universe, and therefore the thing they were standing on must be the center of the universe, or very close to at least, right? But in order to make sense of the observations of how things, my prior, appeal to long exposure of the starry night, right? That creates this arc of moving, quote, moving stars, and then these that doesn't move the same way, which are usually the planets, right? There are comets, shooting stars, whatever. Right? There's an underlying idea in each of them, the Earth-centered and the Sun-centered, and the name says it. It's the one philosophy is based on Earth being at the center and then explaining everything from that. The other one has the sun at the center and explaining everything from that. Now, so you could go into sort of the Occam's razor thing and so on, right? The more shit you have to add in order to explain something, the less likely it is it's a good theory, right? Or if there are two competing theories, which is more precisely Occam's razor, the one with least moving parts and descriptions and epicircles and whatever was necessary for the Earth-centered one suddenly disappears because of the sun-centered. So there's a sort of a likelihood that the one with the least moving parts is a more correct way of using an underlying idea for the theory, so to say. But that's not what I'm going for. The crux of it, both of them has an underlying idea built into it of how it's treated. In both of them, there is an idea. The two competing ideas you have to choose between, right? So if there's more than one idea, you don't have to choose. Maybe you have a third idea. I don't know. But if you understand, there's always an idea built into it. What if this is the case and then I build a theory around it, so to say? There's a similar approach, I think, built into my philosophy that is still sufficiently argued for how it makes sense. But I stick to that idea and then build the rest of the philosophy upon it, right? So if this central starting point, my ontology, is somehow flawed, the rest doesn't work. Or I should treat it as dysfunctional. At least I will sort of say, okay, pause, click pause, back to the drawing board, figure out what is wrong, and at least adjust what I have created here, right? That would be a decent approach. But until then, and I haven't found any flaws, and you can always adjust the deck chairs on the Titanic, but if the ship is going down, it doesn't matter about the deck chairs, right? It matters about the ship going down. So if there's a major problem, you need to deal with that, so to say. If there's a major problem in my philosophy, everything stops and I try to, fix it, right? So the underlying idea sort of goes through, or maybe a new idea takes over and then continues on from there. So this sort of binding together my philosophy so that it doesn't, because if I'm just creating areas of philosophy or whatever that sort of floats alone in the air without being combined to the other ones, I don't take them seriously until the person connects the dots for me, why they are there. Because my whole experience as such feels like interconnectivity, right? And I also think that's why people tend to think of time as something that moves or flows. It's sort of on a train track. There's connection, right? So if all of my experience in a very large extent seems to have a sort of connectivity to it, why wouldn't my philosophy have? Because my philosophy is thinking about how I think, and my thinking is based on some kind of connectivity. So should my philosophy be, in my opinion. Okay, so these are just some sort of remarks, right? Okay, let me get into objectivity. Okay, so first of all, a warning. And you can look at my diagram here to the over there, right? And I have changed a bit of the colors, and I think it's a good idea to keep me down there in the same color as the color of abstractions, because it's not an individual, but I could treat it as a kind of individual depending on the situation, so to say, right? But the whole of me that individual would be all of it, including qualia, cognitions. All of it is phenomena. All the phenomena is me. But me as the idea of me is an abstraction, right? So be careful of not misinterpreting this, right? So, but I think in order to not classify me as the same as an individual, which is not, I'm not cognizing me, so it's actually a flawed presentation, coloring me in the same color as an individual. So I've changed the color of me to the same as qualia, or the same color as the phenomena box. Sorry, right? The phenomena box. And maybe this is not a perfect. Some deeper thinking might create even. I just want to keep it simple, so it doesn't grow out of proportion, and you're none the wiser. It just fucks the whole thing up, right? The diagram is there for help, not the philosophy itself. I try to make that the presentation and the text, right? Okay, so I have this connection between me and individual. And that's the lingo, the communication, right? And because there's this, I'm basically creating a channel between my abstractions and that individual's me, or that individual's abstractions, right? Using lingo, or at least that's what I imagine, because of the idea of the external world, right? But all I have to work with are still my qualia and cognitions, and the individual. I can never get to the me of the individual, or what is known as the problem of other minds, which is not a problem, because that implies that it can be solved. It's the inaccessibility, in my opinion, of a me, because it's something I imagine. It doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a sound, it has none of those, so I can't cognize it, so it's not a part of my phenomena, right? So it's at most in an external world I can imagine. So my warning is this: initiating communication puts you in a weaker position from the beginning, or at least it might. You reveal that you either have a need that individual may exploit, or that the individual thinks you might want to manipulate. Either you're opening up for some unwanted shit to happen, in a way, right? As I say here, communication opens a challenge that can circumvent knowledge. It can deal with knowledge, but it can also impress itself on your emotions and feelings, desires, and so on. This is why we have politicians, right? And they are good at talking and manipulating with language, right? This is basically the channel for sophists, the sophist channel, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be sophistry. So we have to be very careful how we use this channel. Because this is where things might start to get wrong, because this channel has been open since you were born, right? And this channel has probably fucked up your abstractions to some larger or smaller degree, until the point you start doing this. So, one of the jobs for starting philosophy is actually trying to get rid of all the bad shit, right? Getting rid of the bad apples in your abstractions, the dogmas, and so on, right? And that is why I mentioned very early on during ontology, you actually have to more or less get rid of your abstractions and start from scratch. You can maybe bring them back, but you have to be careful, right? So this is the dangerous channel, and there's a reason why it's red, right? And abstractions are red. The dangerous territory. Be careful out there. Okay. And actually, that's what I'm doing now. At least what I'm attempting. I'm using the lingo channel, right? So be careful. I'm trying to avoid impressing myself on abstraction of viewers that I'm not supposed to, according to my own standards for good philosophy. Maybe you could put it like that, right? Okay. So, knowledge is the only phenomena I can get agreement on. It's the only phenomena I can get agreement on. Because it's binary. You could agree that something is blue, for instance, right? You could make a kind of agreement about that. But it's a matter of degree, right? There's something that is lighter blue and darker blue and more pinkish and more reddish and more greenish or yellowish and what the fuck, right? Maybe not yellowish, but that would be green, right? But whatever. But an elephant is either cognized or it's not cognized. So you have to decide very precisely before you start to communicate that you're actually having knowledge, that you're not somehow have conjured yourself into having knowledge that you don't actually have, right? I was told that there's an elephant in the woods, so now I'm looking for that elephant, right? It's, so you have to cognize it, right? And either it's there or it's not there. So either you have knowledge or you don't have knowledge, right? I think that's the only safe way of dealing with idea of knowledge. It has to be it has to be cognitions, and cognitions that are active, quote, at the moment, which is knowledge, right? A similarly well-functioning individual would appreciate that, right? If I'm dealing with knowledge this way and you're dealing with knowledge this way, I would appreciate it, right? And to my standards, and I'm not saying necessarily this has to be the standard, but that's the best. I mean, I've never seen anybody come up with something as clear as this, as the definition of knowledge, right? Or approaching thereafter something called objectivity. It's just, well, I think this is objective because it's whatever, something sort of just grabbed out of some kind of dogma. That's what it sounds like to me, at least, right? Nothing as clear as this. But if I were to, I mean, if I'm the only one having this approach in the world, how am I going to interact with somebody who doesn't have that? But my point might be, I actually think that this is what people are actually doing, because that's what I'm doing, right? If you buy a car, you kind of like to want to see it, right? You want to try and drive it and so on. You're not saying, oh yeah, I have a car. You have a car? Yeah, it's cost $20,000. All right, well, here's $20,000. You would like to sort of, I want to see the car, right? And it's sort of basically, it's that simple. And when we get to that car, right? That's sort of, maybe you should see that scenario to yourself or something similar, right? Maybe come up with your own scenario, see if this works. So it's not like it's sort of far out or anything like that, right? Okay. If not, a similarly well-functioning, because I'm so well-functioning, right? Individual would appreciate that. If not, I should possibly flee. An individual interested in knowledge and what is going on in our present situation will have a similar focus on what is cognitively valuable, right? So if you have an idea of what that apple over there is more valuable to me than that rock over there, right? Because of its potential, my imagined potential, my recollection of it, or whatever. Determining factor or measure stick you're using, right? So usually what kind of knowledge we're interested in is that which is valuable to us. But what is valuable to you might not be the same value to me. But you know, we might haven't, we're both going for that apple. Should we fight over it or what, right? Okay, that's why I need objectivity at some point. An individual interest in what is going on in our present situation, because it's our situation now, in my sense that there is an individual. If I'm saying that individual, there's an individual in the situation of my present cognition field, right? Will have a similar focus on what is cognitively valuable, not be trying to dig into my emotions and desires. So if you sort of come upon an individual who sort of is more interested in digging into your emotions and desires and shit like that, using their particular kind of lingo, and I mean that lingo in the not necessarily only words, but all sorts of other ways of communication. The lingo is their preferred style of communication. And there may be a lot of shit going on, you know. They say that what people hear is more between the lines, and how people look when they say it and how they say it, than what is actually the content of the presentation, the linguistic presentation, right? To deal with the situation at hand, I need only get to agreement about the knowledge I'm interested in, if at all. If I want to initiate and engage in all that, right? There's some, you know, prior steps that needs to be the case in order for me to try to do this now, right? Okay. So I left a bit of the diagram out. And we have the lingo, we have the me down here, and there's an individual over there, and there's some knowledge I have. And there's a gray me over there behind the individual, because I am not communicating with the knowledge individual. I am trying to communicate with the me I am supposing is somewhere in whatever might be out there in the external world, of which the individual is a representation. It's very important you understand this approach of mine, right? But what I have access to, I have the lingos, I have the me, I have the knowledge, and I have the individual. That's what I have access to. I don't have access to the me, but still my lingo is attempting to communicate with the me, right? And through that me, I am trying to decipher from the individual's behavior, so to say, whether or not we can agree on the knowledge. Okay? Okay. 1. I point at the knowledge and communicate the name and await the response from the individual. So I'd say elephant. Point, point, elephant, I say. Right? And then I look at the individual and see how it reacts. If it points and says elephant, right? I observe if the individual, I read out loud here, 2. I observe if the individual reacts by similarly pointing at the knowledge. My knowledge, right? The knowledge that I have, and communicating the name. So we're sort of getting close now, right? But there are some pitfalls in this, right? If yes, I will consider us having objectivity on my knowledge. This is a very bare bone version, and I'm getting into a much more deeper thing in a moment, right? But the way you could define objectivity is when judging from the reaction communication of an individual, I am convinced of agreement with my proposition of my knowledge. This is probably not the best way to phrase it, right? But objectivity is sort of, if I have knowledge and an individual can convince me that by their actions and behavior and lingo, whatever, this is also a kind of action or behavior, right? That they have the same knowledge, then there's objectivity. So, in other way, you could say that objectivity is two subjects, me and the individuals, me, agreeing on an object, right? So, I'm sort of bringing in a new term, but because objects are generally a term used, and there's the term objectivity, it makes sense to use objectivity here to take control of the definition of that term, and also thereby introducing the idea of subjects, right? And so the me becomes subjectivity, and the other person's me becomes the individual's subjectivity, you could say, right? By sort of definition here. But it's just to clarify some of the other terms used in this sort of field. Now, this is sort of very sort of handheld kind of approach to objectivity. So I'll go into a more precise and deeper one, maybe, right? You could say. Okay. As I say here, a more strict description of establishing objectivity would be this. A proposition is made by at least one of the individuals participating, including myself. As a sort of kind of, myself is also sort of understood as an individual, as I indicated in prior parts, right? A proposition is always set up like this by an individual. Communication, that is knowledge. and pointing. And the pointing, however that lingo is, must be cognitive. You must be able to cognize the pointing. So it's the pointing hand, for instance, right? The hand that has the pointing aspect to it. You can't just sort of pretend sort of over there, over where. There has to be some movement, something going on, some cognitive thing that you sort of use to pinpoint exactly what knowledge we're dealing with. It's not that elephant, it is that elephant, right? So it's a two-part thing. It's not enough just to say elephant. You have to say that elephant, right? And when you're doing that, you're pointing. It's a pointing. It doesn't necessarily have to be my finger here. It could be whatever you can come up with. As long as it's cognitive, I think it needs to be that. You may be able, as I say, might be an exception you might want to go with in some cases. But that's up to you, I would say, right? You may be able to make a functional proposition without the pointing part because of circumstances. A relative communication like, well, the elephant next to the big rock over there, right? And then the guy looks, okay, I know that there are no other big rocks, so it must be that elephant because there are no other elephants. And, you know, right? Whatever. Or there are no elephants, other elephants near to a big rock. So it must be, so you can sort of deduce what elephant it is, but it is more risky. It has more risk of a misunderstanding because you could have overlooked that there actually was an elephant over here next to a big rock, but the guy wanted to, or the girl wanted to, you know, direct your attention to that one, right? So by pointing, you're ruling out all other elephants than the ones that are in the direction of your pointing, right? So if there are more than one elephant in that direction, you need to have to say there cannot be objectivity here because there's more than one elephant. So you have to sort of move so that you place yourself in a situation where you say that elephant. Okay, we agree now, right? So then you can have objectivity. The response by the individuals is basically yes or no. There might, as I say, there might be a situation where it's not either or, that if there are two elephants, or if you're not sure that it's an elephant, maybe you better say no, but it's not a strong no then, right? There is an elephant there, or there might actually be an important to deal with that, whatever it is. But because there are two elephants, or you're not quite sure that it's an elephant, or you're not sure enough to say, I have knowledge of elephant over there, then you might try to do something to get to a point where you believe you can get to that. Or then you might need to flee, right? But you're basically, it's a yes or no situation based on whether they're not, the individuals, if you're the one proposing something, right? You're proposing a communicating knowledge and pointing. The response by other individuals is basically yes or no, based on whether their knowledge is in accordance with the proposition or not, right? This kind of response is a truth statement. And instead of yes or no, I use the terms true and false, right? These are particular terms used only to respond to propositions. And propositions has to be composed that way. They have to reference knowledge and there has to be some pointing. Otherwise, it cannot be true or false. By saying something is true, you're indicating a lot of standards that has to be fulfilled. This is true. Well, it's true, this is true. So there must be some pointing on, and there must be some knowledge going on, and so on, right? Otherwise, it's not a true statement. It's not truth apt, right? And you can have true or false exactly because knowledge is binary in nature. Either you experience an elephant or you don't experience an elephant, with of course the sort of somewhat potential gray areas that where you sort of, okay, I'm not sure it's an elephant, but let's check it out or something, whatever, right? But you might as well just say no and back out, right? To be on the safe side. That's up to you. So, there is objectivity about knowledge in a proposition among the individuals responding true and the proposer of knowledge. Or else there's not objectivity. So, this is kind of somewhat complex, right? There's objectivity about knowledge, and it has to be proposed, right? There has to be individuals, and there has to be some true statements or true false response, right? And it's somebody has proposed it, and that somebody must know it, right? Okay, so you are probably already figure out that there is some very dangerous pitfall here, right? Okay. Pitfall or pitfalls of establishing objectivity. I say pitfalls, but there is one major pitfall here, which is basically the big one, right? If there are other sort of somewhat potential gray areas, it's nothing like what this has to deal with, right? Okay, so in the diagram over here, we have the whole things from before, but with objects added that has been objectified or been made objective. These are cognitions, these are knowledge that has become they didn't become it, but the agreement on it is now going to be treated as objective, right? And it's because there are other individuals involved in it that we need the objectivity. Otherwise we might be dealing with different things, or might be dealing with something that somebody else doesn't know. So in order to make sure that we know the same thing we're dealing with, we have to have that objectivity, in my opinion, right? There's sort of it's almost like a minimum standard, right? If you disagree whether or not there's a car or not, I mean, then we have a problem, right? Okay, so objectivity is ultimately based on decision under any circumstance. Since I have no access to anyone else's me or knowledge, and therefore knowledge, right? So I have no way of detecting lies. An individual responding true to a lie would be an individual responding true to a proposition that is actually false to that individual, or vice versa. I mean, saying false if it's actually true. If they have the cognition that matches the proposition, then it's true to them. But if they communicate using their lingo that is false, then they're lying. How can I check that? Well, I can say all I want that I'm experiencing elephant, but I can't get to whether that me out there, which is something I imagine in an external world. So if I can't get to that, I can never check if they have the experienced elephant. All I have to go with is the response. I have to deal with how much I trust the response. And if I don't trust the response, I still don't have objectivity, right? Or at least I shouldn't treat it like that. But this is a scenario that can very quickly become very complicated, right? And this is basically, gaslighting, lying, manipulating, and bullshit, right? This is complete bullshit territory. But if you have been wandering around the woods and with some individual for days and years, and every time he sees a lion, you see the lion, and it just, what is the likelihood it's going to happen? At some point you say, I just have to go with it, right? But it might be a very cunning artist, right? That sort of, okay, if you're a liar, you should only lie when it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, you shouldn't lie. You should be perfectly, truthful, as it might be called, unlying, whatever. And then only when you're at the lion's cave, and you say, it says there's no lying in there, and then you go in there, right? How could he know there's no lying? Because he's not in there. So he has to say, I don't know if there's a lion in there. But if you can be tricked into thinking, well, he must know because he's special or something like that, right? This is politician territory. This is where shit starts to get fucked up, right? And if no wonder people are being manipulated left and right, because there is no prior philosophy in general that guides them, or by which they can guide themselves. They have been trained to listen to lingo, right? The priest, the parents, the television, TikTok, whatever, right? They don't look at the objects of cognitions yourself. No, just listen to the lingo and let it manipulate your emotions, right? Okay, so I have added 2 more definitions, which is a proposition is communication of knowledge and pointing. And there's another definition, which objectivity is proposed knowledge that has been responded with true between 2 or more individuals. And that includes the me that makes the proposition, obviously, right? So, and this is just an overview. This is not the necessarily exact definitions. I like to keep, I don't want definitions because there's a, meaning of terms, and English is not my first language, so I want to still keep the definitions dynamic, right? I don't want to say this is the definition and you can't adjust it, or but I want to keep it open so it's malleable, you could say, right? So it can get to fit even better together than it does now, potentially, right? So what do you think about my objectivity? I think it makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, and it's like, it's not, think about it, right? This is my personal, I try to constantly check whether or not my philosophy sounds like bullshit, right? That I want it to be that. Am I using an agenda? Am I doing this because I want it to be the case? Because ultimately, if I can get to this definition, this, that, and the other, I get things my way. All right? It's so prevalent in by people presenting philosophy. Sometimes it just drips from the presentation, and this is my agenda. I'm just covering it up with fancy terms and lingo to get things my way. I don't want to get things my way only in the case that it's, let's say, perfect or pure philosophy that actually works together. There has to be some checks and balances. I can't just make shit up over there and then end up with a principle of some kind for whatever that has no bearing or connection to my prior philosophy. Then I would treat it as this is garbage, right? So, you see, I have established what is the foundation for knowledge. And then I'm using knowledge all the way to a moral principle, right? Which should be the next and last chapter of this. I might do a few follow-ups, obviously, if, as comments roll in and I come up with something myself and clarifications and adjustments and whatever in the future. Obviously, there might be some of those, right? But hopefully no big ones, right? Oh, there's a new ology I have to make up here, right? That would be right. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and I really appreciate your comment. If you have anything you think, I don't understand this, let me know. I'll try to explain. If there's something that rubs you the wrong way, or you have a notion, it sounds right, but there's something about that part over there, there's something to, right? Let me know, because you might be onto something. Maybe there's something I've overlooked. I mean, this is complete philosophy. There's basically no one in history who does this, right? I'm not trying to bang my own drums, say, I'm so great or something like that. I'm doing it my way, but I'm doing it on a level where I can actually manage to get through this. If I take an approach like, for instance, Bernardo Castro, where I have to spend 150 pages in 10 different books or whatever to describe a metaphysics, God knows how many books he would need to write to do a complete philosophy, right? So this is sort of a finding a balance between getting somewhere but not losing details, right? So this is the right meta level of philosophy. So I hope it comes across that it seems at least functional, right? And there's nothing in it that you can't do yourself. Maybe I should address that. I have not mentioned anything where you need to call me up, right? You don't need me. You can go do this yourself. I suppose, I mean, if you're like me, you can do it yourself, right? You can go and have colors and sounds and taste. You can go and have cognitions, and you can have your abstractions all you want, right? And all these principles and definitions are all based on that. So they shouldn't be trying to do anything you can't do. And that is most important, that it's not a philosophy where I had to sit in an ivory tower handing out commandments to people in order to make them do my bidding, right? That's a clear-cut sign that it's bullshit. It's a power grab. It's an attempt at power structures, right? Where I am the philosopher king, right? You should be warned about people like that. And most philosophers in history at some point venture into some kind of authoritarianism in one way or another. It's just sometimes hidden in the lingo and so on, right? Now, but Plato and his Republic, I mean, it's ghastly. It's basically a fucking dictatorship, right? Where you're born into this and you stay there. I mean, it's atrocious. So, please share, like, and subscribe. Let me have your comment, as I mentioned. And beyond that, see you in the next one, which is hopefully and possibly, very likely, the last one. So, see you there. It might take a few days. I really, 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 really want to do this well, the last one, right? So I'm going to check it, double check it, and triple check it. So it might take a little while before I'm ready with it, because I have to also look through all what I've done so far to make sure that something doesn't stick in the wrong direction and it all hangs together. And when the final job is done, it's sort of cohesive, right? So with that said, see you in the next one.